Why angel numbers appear before major life changes. There is a specific kind of moment most people can recall with unusual clarity. You glance at your phone, not to check anything in particular, just one of those automatic gestures the hands make before the mind catches up, and the time reads 11:11, or 3:33, or 2:22. Something in you pauses, not dramatically, just a quiet interruption in the ordinary flow of the moment, like a sound in another room you cannot quite identify. You notice it, and then you tell yourself it means nothing, which works well enough until it happens again the next day, and the day after that, and slowly, without any decision on your part, you begin to register something that unsettles the dismissal. These numbers are not appearing during your easiest, most settled moments. They appear when you are sitting with a question you haven't said out loud yet, when you are lying awake running through a version of your life that no longer feels like it fits, when you are standing at the edge of something you can sense, but cannot yet name. When a pattern repeats with enough consistency across enough emotionally charged moments, it stops being dismissible, regardless of how much effort you put into dismissing it. This video is not going to tell you that the universe has a plan for you in the way that phrase usually sounds, warm, vague, and ultimately without consequence. What it is going to do is something more specific, and if you stay with it, considerably more useful. It is going to explain the actual mechanism behind why these numbers appear when they do, why they cluster around transition, why they intensify just before something in your life breaks open, and what they are pointing toward with a degree of precision that draws from depth psychology, ancient numerological tradition, and the specific phenomenology of how human consciousness behaves at thresholds. Because most explanations of angel numbers miss the most important detail entirely. The question is never really whether the numbers are meaningful. The question is why they become visible precisely when your life is preparing to change, not during stable, contented periods when you have energy to spare for curiosity, but always in the margins of uncertainty, in the hours of private recalibration, in the weeks when you are quietly dismantling something and don't yet know what you are building in its place. That specificity of timing is the real phenomenon, and it carries an explanation that is both spiritually coherent and psychologically grounded, which means you don't have to choose between those two frameworks because they are pointing toward the same thing from different directions. The discomfort of not being able to explain what you've been noticing rationally, while also being unable to dismiss it honestly, is not a sign that you are reading too much into things. It is the threshold state itself, and the numbers appearing inside it are not decoration. They are part of the structure of how transition announces itself to those paying close enough attention. By the end of this video, you will understand what that structure is. You will be able to look at the specific numbers appearing in your life right now and read them with more precision than reassurance. And you will understand why the fact that you are noticing them at all is not a small thing. Something in your life is already moving. This is where we begin to decode what it is. The timing problem. There is something worth paying attention to before anything else, and it is not the numbers themselves. It is when they appear. If you trace the moments honestly, not the times you looked at your phone and it read 4:47 or 9:13, but the moments the repeated sequences stopped you, the moments they landed with that particular quality of weight, you will likely find a pattern that has nothing to do with frequency and everything to do with emotional context. They did not appear with that intensity on the morning you felt certain about your work, settled in your relationships, at ease in your own life. They appeared in the gap between versions of yourself, in the waiting room between what was and what has not yet become. This is not a coincidence to be explained away. It is a structural feature of the phenomenon, and recognizing it changes everything about how you interpret what you have been experiencing. Liminal is the word that most precisely names what that space is. It comes from the Latin limen, meaning threshold, and it describes the condition of being in between, no longer fully in the old structure, not yet arrived in the new one. Anthropologists identified it first in the context of ritual transitions, those formalized passages that nearly every human culture has developed to mark the crossing from one state of life to another. The initiate is neither child nor adult. The grief holder is neither whole nor permanently broken. The one standing at the edge of a major decision is neither the person who has not yet chosen, nor the person who already lives with the choice. Liminality is that suspended space, and it has a specific psychological texture: heightened perception, intensified meaning-making, a sense that something important is at stake without always being able to articulate what. Angel numbers are functionally linked to liminal states, not because a cosmic force is directing traffic at thresholds, though that interpretation is available if it resonates with you, but because the threshold state itself alters the quality of attention in ways that make these patterns suddenly visible and suddenly significant. The numbers were always there. The 1111 occurred on ordinary Tuesdays too, in months when your life felt stable and unremarkable, but you looked and moved on, because nothing inside you was primed to receive that particular signal. Liminal states prime you. They open a register of perception that stable ground tends to keep quiet. What this means practically is that when the signs begin appearing with that unmistakable quality of weight and repetition, the information they carry is not primarily about the future. It is about the present. The message embedded in their timing is not, something is coming. It is, you are already in it. You are already inside the threshold. The transition you sense but cannot yet name is not approaching. It is occurring. That recognition alone tends to shift something. The disorientation of the liminal state is partly caused by not having a frame for it. Once you understand that the in-between has its own logic and its own duration and its own signals, the experience becomes something you can navigate rather than something that is simply happening to you. But if the timing is a structural feature rather than a random one, there must be a mechanism explaining why that structure exists. There must be a reason why the boundary between inner state and outer pattern becomes so permeable at precisely these moments. That mechanism has a name, and it was given to it by one of the most rigorous minds in the history of psychology. What synchronicity actually is. Carl Jung spent decades doing something that made many of his contemporaries deeply uncomfortable. He took seriously the experiences that rationalist frameworks were designed to dismiss. He was not a mystic in the conventional sense. He was a clinician, a theorist, a man trained in the hardest empirical traditions of early 20th century medicine. And yet, again and again in his practice and in his own life, he encountered something the prevailing models could not account for: the appearance of a meaningful connection between an inner psychological event and an outer material one, with no causal relationship between them that science could identify. He called this synchronicity. Not coincidence, which implies random co-occurrence and carries no meaning. Not causality, which implies a mechanism connecting cause to effect, something structurally different from both. And a causal connecting principle, a collapse of the boundary between the interior world of psychic experience and the exterior world of material events, occurring in a way that produces unmistakable meaning for the person who witnesses it. His most famous clinical example is precise. A patient was describing a dream involving a golden scarab when, at that exact moment, a scarabaeid beetle tapped against the closed window behind Jung. He opened the window and caught the insect in his hand, handing it to her. "Here is your scarab." She had been almost entirely intellectually defended against the emotional work her therapy required. That event broke something open in her. The coincidence was too specific, too weighted, too perfectly timed to be processed by the part of the mind that dismisses, and it unlocked what months of rational conversation had not been able to reach. What Jung was describing was not magical thinking. He was pointing toward a hypothesis about the deep structure of reality, one in which psyche and matter are not as categorically separate as the Western scientific tradition has generally assumed. He was not claiming that one causes the other. He was observing that at certain moments, particularly moments of psychological intensity and transition, the membrane between inner and outer seems to thin, and correspondences appear that carry what he called numinous weight, a quality of meaning that feels larger than personal preference and more real than coincidence. Angel numbers, understood through this framework, are not messages transmitted from an external source through the medium of a clock face. They are synchronicities, moments in which an outer pattern, a repeated number on a screen or a sign, corresponds with sufficient precision to an inner state, a question being held, a transition being undergone, to produce that specific quality of weight and recognition. The number is not causing the state is not causing the number. They are occurring together in a way that carries meaning, and the meaning is the phenomenon. This reframing matters for a practical reason. It moves the question from "is this real?" to something considerably more useful. What is this reflecting back to me? If synchronicities arise at the intersection of inner state and outer pattern, then the content of what appears is functioning as a mirror, showing you something about the psychological and energetic state you are actually in, not the state you are performing, but the real interior condition underneath. And each number in that reflection is not arbitrary. The language of angel numbers is not a single undifferentiated message dressed in different costumes. Each number carries a distinct symbolic grammar, a specific frequency of meaning calibrated to a different aspect of transition, which means that what is appearing for you right now is not a generic spiritual signal. It is a specific one. The numerological language of transition. Numerology is older than most of the philosophical traditions that Western culture treats as foundational. Its roots reach into Pythagorean mathematics, into Kabbalistic letter number correspondences, into the symbolic systems of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, into the I Ching's structural understanding of change as a patterned rather than random process. What these traditions share, across enormous differences of culture and method, is the intuition that numbers are not merely quantitative tools. They are qualitative signatures, each one the formal expression of a specific type of force moving through a cycle of transformation. When these traditions are applied to the phenomenon of angel numbers, the result is not a set of arbitrary meanings assigned to arbitrary sequences. It is a coherent interpretive grammar in which each repeated number speaks to a distinct phase of transition. Understanding which number is appearing for you and in what combination with others is not about predicting what will happen. It is about reading where in the arc of change you currently are. 111 or 1111 is the number of initiation. It marks the moment before the new current is fully formed, but when the conditions for it are assembling. When 111 appears with intensity and repetition, it tends to indicate that something new is attempting to establish itself, not necessarily in the external circumstances yet, but in the fundamental orientation of your attention and energy. It is the number that appears when you are approaching a new beginning before you have conscious access to what that beginning is. The signal it carries is not "something will happen." It is "the field is opening." 444 carries a very different frequency. Where 111 is initiatory and forward-oriented, 444 is stabilizing and present tense. It appears most characteristically during periods of genuine structural collapse, when the old framework is actively breaking down and the disorientation is greatest. Its traditional meaning across multiple numerological lineages is that of grounding and support, the presence of a stabilizing force precisely when the ground beneath you feels most unstable. If you have been seeing 444 repeatedly during a period of difficulty or uncertainty, the signal embedded in its appearance is not that everything is fine. It is that the instability is real, but you are not as structurally unsupported as the experience of it suggests. 555 is the number of disruption, not catastrophe, but the specific energetic signature of transformation that cannot happen without genuine disruption of what currently exists. It tends to appear during periods of accelerating change, when events are moving faster than the capacity to process them, and the ground is shifting beneath every step. Its appearance is not a warning. It is a description, the symbolic expression of a moment when the old form can no longer hold, and something fundamentally different is being forged in the pressure of that collapse. 777 carries the quality of alignment. It appears during moments of unusual coherence between inner state and outer circumstance, when what you are doing and what you sense you are meant to be doing are temporarily occupying the same space. It is less a marker of transition than a confirmation of right orientation during transition, a moment of energetic resonance that tends to appear briefly and with particular luminosity before the next phase of pressure begins. 999 is completion. Of all the angel number sequences, it carries the strongest association with endings, and specifically with the kind of ending that is necessary for anything genuinely new to begin. When 999 appears with frequency and weight, it typically marks the final phase of a cycle that has been running for a significant period, sometimes years. The emotion it accompanies is often grief, or the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying something that has already ended before you have been able to set it down. The cluster of numbers appearing for you right now is not random, and it is not uniform. It is a diagnostic of the specific phase of transition you are in, and that specificity is itself meaningful information. But beneath both the spiritual grammar of numerology and the Jungian framework of synchronicity, there is a third explanation for why this is happening to you now. One that comes not from philosophy or mystical tradition, but from the neurological mechanics of how human consciousness behaves when its operating models begin to break. The psychology of pattern recognition. During crisis, the brain is, at its most fundamental operational level, a prediction machine. This is not a metaphor. The dominant model in contemporary cognitive neuroscience describes the brain as a hierarchical system of predictive models, constantly generating expectations about what the next moment will contain based on everything it has learned about how the world works. Most of what you experience as perception is not raw sensory data being passively received. It is your brain's predictions being compared against incoming information, with attention flowing primarily to the gaps, the places where the prediction and the reality diverge. When your life is stable, when the social structures, relational patterns, professional frameworks, and internal self-concept that organize your experience are all functioning within expected parameters, the predictive models run smoothly. The world confirms the maps. The brain is efficiently allocating resources to maintain the system as is. When the models begin to break down, when a relationship that has organized years of your interior life begins to fail, when a career that has structured your sense of purpose reveals itself as no longer viable, when the version of yourself you have been inhabiting stops fitting the life you are actually living, the predictive system destabilizes. The maps no longer reliably match the territory, and in that condition, the brain shifts into a fundamentally different mode of operation, a state of hypervigilant scanning for pattern, for meaning, for any reliable signal in an environment that has become less predictable. This shift has measurable perceptual consequences. People in states of significant life uncertainty consistently report a qualitative change in how they experience the world around them. Colors seem more vivid. Small events carry unexpected weight. Connections between unrelated things become suddenly obvious. The world feels somehow charged, as if it is trying to communicate something that ordinary perception is too habituated to register. This is not delusion. It is the natural consequence of a brain that has suspended its automatic reliance on established models and begun attending, with unusual intensity, to what is actually present. In this state, angel numbers do not multiply. What multiplies is your capacity to notice them and to assign them weight. The repeated sequences were appearing before your transition began, on ordinary days throughout the year. But the settled mind scans efficiently and dismisses what does not fit the active prediction. The destabilized mind scans with an entirely different level of granularity, catching what it would ordinarily filter out and holding those catches up to the light of meaning, because that is what a pattern-hungry brain in a state of productive uncertainty does. This does not reduce the phenomenon to neurology any more than explaining the mechanism of vision reduces a landscape to optics. The meaning is still present. The timing is still structurally significant. But understanding the psychological mechanism allows you to stop questioning your own perception and start engaging with what it is actually offering you. You are perceiving with unusual clarity patterns that are genuinely there, and you are perceiving them with unusual clarity because your consciousness has been, by the pressure of your own transition, temporarily upgraded into a more sensitive instrument, which brings into focus the question the signs themselves have been circling. The question the heightened perception is, in a sense, asking on your behalf. What, specifically, is your life preparing? What your life is actually preparing. There is a difference between understanding a phenomenon intellectually and being able to read what it is saying specifically, in your own life, about your own situation. The frameworks built so far are real and useful, but they are also general. What you are living is particular, and the cluster of signs appearing for you right now is not a general message. It is a specific one. The diagnostic function of angel numbers depends on reading them not as individual appearances, but as a pattern across time. Which numbers, in what sequence, across what emotional context, at what density? A single appearance of 555 in a moment of stress is one thing. A month of recurring 555, followed by the emergence of 999 in the same period that 333 begins appearing, is a different kind of communication entirely. It is a sequence with internal logic, and that logic tells a story about the specific arc of transition currently unfolding. 333 is worth introducing here, because it carries a meaning that is frequently misread. Its traditional association is with creative alignment and authentic expression, but more precisely, it tends to appear during the period when something that has been developing beneath conscious awareness begins pressing toward the surface. It is the number of emergence before manifestation, the symbolic marker of something that has been gathering internal momentum finally beginning to make itself known. When 333 appears in the same cluster as 555 and 999, the diagnostic reading is relatively coherent. A cycle is completing, disruption is the mechanism of its completion, and something forming in the space created by that disruption is beginning to declare itself. Reading your own cluster requires honesty about the emotional quality of the period you are in. Are the signs appearing primarily during moments of grief, exhaustion, or loss? That points toward 9999 territory, completion energy, an ending that needs to be fully acknowledged before the next cycle can begin with any integrity. Are they appearing during moments of acceleration, of structures that felt solid suddenly proving fluid? That is, 555 territory, disruptive transformation, the necessary chaos of a form being rebuilt rather than merely repaired. Are they appearing during quiet moments of unusual clarity, when something you cannot quite articulate nonetheless feels exactly right? That is the register of 777, brief alignment, a momentary landing on the frequency you are moving toward. The specific numbers appearing in your life right now are not interchangeable with anyone else's configuration. They are calibrated to your actual interior state, because that interior state is precisely what is generating the synchronistic field within which they appear. The content of the mirror reflects the psychological reality of the one standing in front of it, which means that whatever you are seeing, however uncomfortable or uncertain the pattern is, it is showing you something real about where you are and where the current of your life is actually moving. There is one more layer to this. Before a major transition completes and fully enters conscious reality, before you can name it or describe it, something unusual happens with the signs themselves. The pattern does not hold steady. It does something that, if you have been in a significant threshold period, you may already recognize. Why the signs intensify right before the break. There is a phase in every major transition that arrives just before the shift becomes undeniable. Before the decision is made, before the conversation happens, before the door closes behind you on something you are leaving or opens in front of you on something you are entering. It is the period of maximum pressure, the moment when the old structure is most stressed and the new one has not yet formed. When everything that has been stable feels most unstable, and everything uncertain feels most urgent. And in this phase, if you have been attending to the signs, something specific happens. They become almost relentless. Where before there was 1 or 2 a week, now there are several in a day. Where before the pattern was intermittent, now it is insistent. Where before you could reasonably wonder whether you were reading too much into things, now the density is difficult to explain away. Colors in the pattern you hadn't noticed before begin appearing. New sequences emerge alongside the familiar ones. The symbolic field seems to reach a kind of maximum saturation. This intensification is not arbitrary, and it is not a warning. It is the energetic equivalent of pressure building before release. In physical systems, pressure accumulates to maximum density at the moment, just before a phase transition occurs. Water does not simply become steam in a gradual, linear process. It heats until the moment of threshold, and then the transition happens rapidly and completely. The period of maximum pressure is not the sign that something is wrong. It is the sign that the transition is imminent. The system is approaching the point at which its current form can no longer hold, and the energy that will power the transformation is reaching its peak accumulation. In the context of a major life transition, this psychological and energetic peak corresponds to the most cognitively and emotionally demanding moment of the threshold period. Your predictive models are under maximum strain. The gap between the life you have been living and the life your interior state is pressing toward has never been wider or more uncomfortable. The brain, in its heightened signal detection mode, is operating at maximum sensitivity, and within that sensitivity, the synchronistic field reaches maximum density, more signs, more frequently, with more weight, because the capacity to perceive and hold them is at its peak, and because the interior state generating the synchronistic correspondence is at its most intense. What this means practically is that the period of most overwhelming sign density is not a period to fear or interpret as something going wrong. It is confirmation that you are at the apex of the threshold. The break, when it comes, will not arrive as a gradual lessening of pressure. It will arrive as a shift, a moment when something that had felt impossible to resolve suddenly resolves, when something you couldn't see suddenly becomes clear, when the decision or the change that the whole arc has been building toward finally enters the actual rather than remaining in the possible. And when that happens, something specific changes internally, in a way that feels like a different quality of attention beginning. The moment you stop questioning and start listening, there is a turning point in every genuine threshold crossing, and it tends to arrive quietly without announcement, in the middle of what has been a very loud internal process. For weeks or months, the experience has been characterized by a particular kind of noise. The back and forth of trying to rationalize and then not being able to, trying to dismiss and then not being able to, trying to assign the signs to coincidence and finding the coincidence explanation structurally inadequate, trying to believe they are meaningful, and then fearing you are simply reading what you want into neutral data. That oscillation is exhausting. It is also, as everything explored in this video has been building toward, a phase. It does not resolve by reaching a conclusive intellectual verdict about whether angel numbers are real. It resolves when something in you makes a different kind of decision, not to believe exactly, but to engage, to take the signs seriously as information rather than continuing to audit them as evidence. This is a subtle distinction, but it is a significant one. Belief requires certainty about the mechanism. Engagement requires only that you act as though the pattern is communicating something worth attending to. And engagement, once genuinely undertaken, produces a very different relationship to the threshold period you are in. You stop being a confused observer of something happening to you and become an active participant in something you are moving through. The question shifts from, "Why is this happening?" to, "What is this showing me that I need to understand?" When that shift occurs, the signs themselves tend to change in quality, even if not immediately in quantity. What felt like an insistent external knock begins to feel more like an internal compass. The 555 that once felt alarming in its intensity begins to function as navigational information. You are in disruption. Disruption is the vehicle of the transformation you are in, which means the chaos is not a malfunction, but the process itself working. The 999 that once felt like loss or termination begins to reveal its second meaning. Completion is the condition of genuine new beginning, and the grief attached to what is ending is exactly proportional to how real that thing was. This reorientation is not passive. It requires something psychologically demanding, the willingness to let the signs inform your interpretation of your own experience, rather than simply confirming the interpretation you arrived with. If you are using the signs as validation for a story you have already decided is true, you are not listening. Listening, in this context, means genuine openness to being shown something about your situation that your conscious mind has not yet assembled on its own. The people who move through major transitions with the most coherence, who emerge from the threshold with something genuinely new rather than a rebuilt version of the old, tend to share this quality. They developed, at some point during the threshold period, the capacity to treat their own inner life as a source of real information rather than something to be managed or overridden. The signs, understood properly, are one of the forms that information takes. Not the only form, not a substitute for practical action or clear thinking, but a register of signal available when the more familiar registers have become unreliable. And that register, for those willing to engage it seriously, is frequently more accurate than the analytical mind operating under maximum uncertainty. The transition is not over when you reach this turning point, but something essential has changed. You are standing differently inside the threshold now, and what remains is to understand what happens when you finally step through it. After the change. Major life transitions do not end in a single moment, though there is often a moment that serves as the functional hinge between before and after. The conversation that was finally had, the decision that was finally made and acted on, the loss that was finally, fully, acknowledged as permanent rather than possible. Something crosses from the realm of potential into the realm of actual, and the threshold period, which may have lasted months or years, begins to close. One of the most disorienting aspects of post-transition life is the quiet. After weeks or months of sign density, after the hypervigilant perception and the relentless pattern recognition and the symbolic weight distributed across ordinary moments, the new baseline can feel strangely flat. The signs do not necessarily disappear entirely, but their frequency and particular quality of weight diminish. The phone reads 1111, and something in you notes it without the charged pause that once accompanied it. The number appears, the moment passes, and you continue with what you were doing. This silence is not abandonment. The impulse to interpret it as a withdrawal of guidance or support is understandable and also inaccurate. The silence is the signal that the threshold has been crossed. The liminal state, which required and generated heightened perception, has resolved. You are no longer in the in-between. You are in the new place, and the new place does not produce the same quality of signal because it does not require the same quality of reception. The brain that was operating in hypervigilant signal detection mode is returning to a more integrated baseline because the crisis that demanded maximum sensitivity has passed. What is true, and what emerges over time in the period following a genuine transition, is that the new baseline is not identical to the old one. Something about how you attend to the world has shifted. The threshold period trained a capacity that does not fully deactivate when the threshold is crossed. The register of symbolic attention that was opened by the transition remains available, more accessible than it was before, more trusted, more integrated into how you read your own experience. And when the next threshold approaches, as thresholds do across the arc of a life, you will not be entering the liminal state as someone who has never been there before. You will enter it as someone who has learned, however difficult the process, to navigate from within it. There is one more thing worth naming, and it is perhaps the most important observation in this entire video. Not about the signs, but about the fact that you are noticing them. The attention you brought to these patterns, the willingness to take seriously something your rational mind could not fully explain, the refusal to dismiss your own experience simply because it lacked a convenient framework. That attention was itself part of the transition. It was evidence that something in you was already awake to the change before your conscious mind had caught up to it. The signs did not appear to a passive recipient. They appeared to someone whose interior life had already begun shifting, and whose quality of attention had already opened enough to receive them. You were already moving toward something larger, something that required the kind of awareness the threshold period was developing in you all along. That awareness is yours now, built piece by piece, sign by sign, through every moment of uncertainty and every quiet pause of recognition across the entire arc of what you have been living. The numbers were never the message, the attention was.